Think Forward. Think Research Channel.
The following is a presentation of the American Meteorological Society. Founded in 1919, the 13,000 plus members of the American Meteorological Society strive to advance and communicate knowledge concerning the atmosphere and related sciences, technologies, applications, and services for the benefit of society. At each AMS annual meeting, time is devoted not only to presenting the latest in scientific discoveries, but also how scientists can translate this knowledge in terms understandable to other scientists, lay audiences, and the public at large. The first of our three speakers is Dr. Anthony Socci, Senior Science and Communications Fellow of the American Meteorological Society. Dr. Socci will set the stage, discussing some of the challenges facing scientists who are trying to communicate with the press and the public. Our second speaker is Professor Arthur Lupia, who is the Hal R. Varian Collegiate Professor of Political Science at the University of Michigan. He asks the question, can social scientists help you combat global warming? Our third speaker is Molly Bentley. She is a science correspondent for BBC America, who will provide advice on breaking the ice between reporters and scientists during the International Polar Year.
Okay, let me start way back in time. Walter Lippmann, the noted journalist and entrepreneur journalist, involved in government work as well, public relations during the war, World War I. He wrote a book in 1920 called Liberty and the News, and in that book he said a number of things that I think could easily be said today about the state of communication today, the state of a number of institutions involved with communication. So let me go through a little bit of Lippmann's, what was in his head at the time, and bring us into the 21st century. He basically said that without protection against propaganda, without standards of evidence, which was his intended definition of journalistic objectivity, this process of verification. Without the criteria of emphasis, the living substance of all popular decisions is exposed to every prejudice and to infinite exploitation. I think most of us can see that on a regular basis today. I think that comes as no surprise to most of us. And while we're on the subject of objectivity, Lippmann, in this book, laid out the notion of objectivity in the realm of journalism. And he said, look, journalists, like scientists, are not objective. None of us are. But we expect the methodology or the process to lead to a kind of objectivity, the process being a process of verification. Okay? So it doesn't mean that we can't be biased. We are. But presumably and hopefully we have a process that trims down or pares back some of that bias. And in that rendition, he basically said neutrality is not a fundamental principle of journalism. I would add to that, neither is balance, because the bottom line was, what are the facts? What's the truth of the situation? What are the facts? And so this sense of neutrality that we sometimes see network news broadcasters take this sort of neutral voice, well, it's an artifice. It's not. You know, that's not objectivity, okay? Mistrust. Now I'd like to just try to paint the landscape in which communication is taking place today. In a survey in 1960 conducted among people in the U.S., people were asked if they agreed or disagreed with this statement. And the statement is, overall, most people can be trusted. At that time, 65% of those who responded yes, they can, affirmatively. Same survey was given in the 90s sometime, and only 35% of the people responded affirmatively. So we've lost a lot of trust in our institutions and people sort of trusting other people. Media believability. There was a study, a survey that just came out last week, and it basically pointed to the fact that there's significant declines in the percentage of Americans who say they believe all or most of news reporting. And so we've got a growing skepticism within the public about our institutions for delivering so-called objective information. Yet after Lippmann, yeah, thanks. You can go back and look at it later. After Lippmann formulated this notion of objectivity, he basically, his conclusion was that if we have a process for journalists whereby this process of verification, they didn't need to worry about their biases. And so in the end, he basically thought that facts matter, that if we give people the facts, they'll come to the right conclusions. And yet after he said that, he reconsidered that idea. And I'm just going to walk you through this colloquy here. He started reading studies in psychology that were coming out at the time, pre-1920, psychology and persuasion. And he began to fear that the problems being failures of the press, being remedied by more responsible reporting, objectivity, verification, that the average citizen could make intelligent judgments if presented with the facts, went beyond censorship, ignorance, or distortion. It went to the very nature and workings of the human perception and the human mind. We humans, according to a number of studies now out, a number of books, we don't automatically and objectively see what's before our eyes. We filter the world, outer world, to correspond to our inner world, and we interpret the world as we are. And so he worried that even if you cleaned up all these institutions, even if you got objectivity, even if media said, okay, we'll do this, we'll buy into this process of verification, he began to worry that that's not enough, that facts alone don't inherently lead to people making the so-called right decisions based on reason and facts. And so I want to sort of bring us up to the 21st century and ask a series of questions, which I hope our panelists will dig into here. This particular statement comes from George Lakoff, and he calls this a communication myth. And I'm raising it as a question because I'm not sure it is. I don't know. The truth will set us free. If we just tell people the facts, since people are basically rational beings, they'll all reach the right conclusions. I think we in the science community have felt that way, whether explicitly or implicitly, for many years, that if we got the facts right, if we got it out there, if we said it as eloquently as we could say it, decisions, rational decisions would follow. And I think we've discovered that's not necessarily true. Don't we all frame things, often unconsciously, and isn't it how we organize and comprehend reality? Well, Lakoff means by frames that we have these metaphors in the back of our head. They're unconscious, and that sometimes language can tap into those metaphors and provoke a response. And it's his idea, and others, that by framing issues, by tapping into those subconscious or unconscious metaphors that we have, we do a better job of reaching people. Now, in this discussion, that's up for grabs. I'm not saying that's a given. I'm just saying this is what Lakoff and others have said. Information and action, are they related? I mean, if you inform somebody, you do it well, you give them the facts, does it lead to action, or perhaps the action that you desired? Does one lead to the other automatically? John Krosnick from Stanford University does a number of surveys. He's a sociologist, political scientist. And he's been working on surveys about attitudes about global warming. And he was interviewed recently in 2006. And in that interview, Krosnick was saying that, or the interviewee was paraphrasing Krosnick, and that Krosnick was concerned that his research finds that scientists are frustrated. Basically saying we have a really serious problem with the environment, how come nobody is listening? Well, I want to ask the question, if the goal of science community is to inform, then why the frustration? If we felt that what we were doing is informing, why are we frustrated? Or did we mean to do more than inform? And are the two the same? Did we want to change behavior or inform, or both? Did we want the information to lead to behavioral changes? And I'm raising the question again following that, what went wrong? Or did anything go wrong? Or was it our perception that something went wrong? Does it follow that if you give people the facts, they should act accordingly? Would one take the same approach to informing as one would take to shaping behavior? Are these different approaches to communication? My gut answer, without knowing a thing, is that yes, I suspect they are. Do reason and matter and facts matter in shaping behavior or prompting people to act on knowledge? That's up for grabs. Or are we relegated now to communicating via the use of dueling frames? Are we now in a situation where we have to get out there and put our frame around a set of facts, try to tap into somebody's subconscious metaphors to sort of open them up to the message or the facts? Or is framing really the way people have always incorporated knowledge and acted on that knowledge, and we just didn't realize it? The frames trump facts. Facts are irrelevant. Can we hope for something better from our collective laborers in gathering intelligence or being intelligent? We spend our time as scientists doing things we think are smart, trying to dig out facts and so on. In a recent article in the Columbia Journalism Review, Brent Cunningham, one of the editors of Columbia Journalism Review, said, basically, do we need a rhetoric beat, a rhetoric beat in the media to help political discourse, to clear it up, to make it as clear and intellectually honest as possible? In other words, pull these metaphors apart that are hanging out there, pull these frames apart so people can understand what these frames are encapsulating. And I've given some examples here. These are some of the frames that Cunningham referred to. The notion of death tax versus estate tax. I mean, when you think about it, it has a sense of a different way of thinking about it when you really give these enhanced interrogation techniques versus torture, unlawful enemy combatant versus prisoner of war, 9/11 as an act of war versus an act of mass murder. And global warming versus climate variability. I could go on and on, but you get the idea. These are so-called frames, competing frames. The facts, well, I've gone through that, yeah. We've been there. Or is framing just spin? Is this just another word for public relations? And are we now asking the science community to engage in public relations? And has it really come down to researchers framing their own work or having others frame it for them? Are you left in that dilemma where if you don't frame it, somebody will, and therefore, in order to take control of, your information, so to speak, you're almost forced into this position? And let me leave you with this as a measure of the landscape in which we are being asked to communicate in. And so, thank you. Arthur.
Thank you very much. Thanks to Tony for putting this together. This is a very nice opportunity. My background is I have a PhD from Caltech, and what that means is I spent a lot of time with applied math and statistics. And when you do that, and you want to have an audience of more than 10 people, you have to figure out ways to try and convey complex things in a different way. And so that not only became a strategy that I used to talk about my own work, it became what I study and what I want to talk to you about today. So I conduct research on how people make decisions when they don't have a lot of information. As some of you know from personal experience, in politics, the field that I study, making decisions without a lot of information is something that happens a lot. So how do you convey ideas in that setting? Well, if you understand how and why people think about political issues, I and a bunch of others have examined, have explored how you can develop more effective strategies for reaching your target audience and getting them to think in different ways. So what's at issue? There's an outcome that you may desire. It might be informing people new things about the climate. It might be getting them to change their behaviors in ways that maybe reduce emissions. And so how do you do that? Well, there are a lot of different ideas. There's education as a general matter. You can write books and articles and things of that nature. You hold seminars, mass mailings, websites, ways to try and persuade people. Is this a good idea? Are these the types of things you should be spending your time on? And some of it depends on the relationship between how hard it is to put together and what the ultimate effect is. All right? So what do we think about these effects? Well, typically, an education effort is formed by a group that I'll call us. We have an idea of things that are socially beneficial, that people ought to know. We've sorted through the facts, and we believe that, at least in some areas, we've reached the right conclusions. And so we decide to try and inform people. But more often than not, it doesn't work out the way we thought it did. People don't tune in. Or if they tune in, they don't pay attention. Or if they pay attention, they don't remember. And even if they remember, they don't act. Right? So people like us can find this very frustrating. Why does this happen? Well, there is a common explanation. And the common explanation is it's their fault. They are the audience, right? They're ignorant. Boy, if they just knew what was important, they'd tune in. Or they're lazy, right? Why are they spending all this time with ESPN and Paris Hilton and Britney Spears? Why aren't they paying attention to us? Or maybe it's apathy. Maybe they'll tell you they know things, but they just won't act, okay? And so that's a very common view. And what I want to suggest to you is, if you think that's the problem, then the real problem is you. Okay? But fortunately, social science, some things that people have learned, can help you be more effective in dealing with an audience. So what we share, the we that we had before, are good intentions. But at the moment of execution, things start to fall apart. Because we typically base our stories about what kinds of persuasive efforts will work and which won't on flawed and centuries-old theories of information and learning. Things that have been proven false, ideas that have been proven false by social scientists 10, 20, 50, 70 years ago. And yet they remain as part of the folk theory of how people learn. For example, many people think, well, I'm good at persuasion, I'm good at teaching. You say, well, how do you know that? And in your memory banks, what you recall are instances where you said something to someone and they said, yes, no, I get it, now I remember that. Let me suggest to you that those events are far more likely to be remembered than what typically happens when you talk to somebody, which is they nod politely, they give the appearance that they're listening, but in fact they're thinking about something else. And seconds later, in terms of their memory, it's as if your conversation never happened. That is the typical outcome of a conversational attempt. But we don't remember that, right? Because we don't see that and people try and mask it. But let me suggest that that's typically what happens. So for you to try and educate an audience, to try and inform them, you've got to overcome that type of odds. So what I'm going to tell you a couple stories about what social scientists know, but because attention is short, I'm going to give you the short version of what the lesson here is. You and your friend are walking through the woods. Your friend gets lost. You want your friend to not be lost. How do you do this? Well, you could yell out directions. You could say, all right, now take 3 steps to the left. Right? Now take 3 steps to the right. But let me suggest to you that if you don't begin by knowing where they are, they walk into trees. They fall into rivers. If you want to get someone from where they are to where you want them to be, first you have to know where they are. And a lot of what social science is about is uncovering where they are and what kind of steps they can take, what kind of steps they're willing to take to get them to places you might want them to be. I'm going to talk about three kinds of examples from the social sciences in terms of how we figure out where they are and where they can go. I'm going to draw your attention to the science of attention, what people can pay attention to. I'm going to talk about the science of elaboration, which is technical talk for thinking about something. And then I'm going to talk about credibility, which is if I'm thinking about something, if I'm actually listening to you, how do I decide whether or not to believe you? Okay? So first I want to talk about attention. There are two kinds of attention. There's working memory, and that's the bottleneck. That's one. We'll talk about long-term memory in a second. But working memory is what you're doing right now. You try to pay attention to things. It's your ability to process information in the moment. What we know about working memory is that its capacity is extraordinarily limited. You can hold 7 plus or minus 2 chunks of information in your short-term memory at any time. What does that mean? Well, right now, I'm speaking, and you're looking at me as though you're listening. Okay? But what are you able to think about right now? Well, you can think about what I'm saying right now, or you can think about where you're going to go next, or what you did this morning, or the laundry, or whether you're going to meet your plane, or so forth. Any one of those things that are in your mind necessarily crowds out anything else. So if you look at the lovely curtains or the patterns in the wall, they crowd out your ability to pay attention to other things. When you give a speech or when you give a presentation, you're not immune from that. You're dealing with the bottleneck, and it affects how people hear you. So for example, in this speech right now, you can listen to what I'm saying right now and pay attention to it, or you can listen to what I'm saying right now, or right now. But at some point, it becomes very difficult, and this matters, because sometimes when you think you give a speech, people listen to the whole thing. They hear the whole thing. They don't. They hear fragments. If you've said something very interesting that makes people think, they're probably not hearing the next couple words you say, right? So when you're creating a speech, it's not so much about a great speech, it's about creating great moments in a speech that people will remember. Because after your speech is done, what people will remember about it is very small. Now you might say, how small is it? Let me suggest to you, ask you to think for a moment about the most important events in your life. You know, a marriage, the birth of children, a graduation from college. I would challenge you to think about that event for more than a minute. Can you generate a minute of memories about something that lasted an hour, a day, several years? In all likelihood, you can't. Even though these events you regard as important, your ability to remember them is minuscule, right? This is true in your own life, and it's true when you give a speech, right? It's true when you give a presentation. What people remember is only a fragment of what you present, and it may not be what you want them to remember. So how do you succeed in this environment? Okay. Well, here's the trick. You have to get people to think about it, right? You have to get people to think about what you're saying. It's called elaboration. And I can give you technical talk about elaboration, but instead I just want to invoke Arnold Schwarzenegger, right? And working out, right? So when you think about something, what's happening physically? Well, in your mind, in your brain, there are neurons and there are dendrites. And dendrites are extensions, and they send electrical activity back and forth to one another. It's this electrical and chemical activity that is the physical basis of your thinking. When you think about something, it's like working out. You're making the connection between two ideas more efficient, right? That's what thinking about it means. And you're actually, physically when you work out, your muscles get stronger and bigger, able to react more. A similar process happens in your brain. It's a physical process, right? You can see it sometimes, okay? And that's what you're trying to get people to do. But because of the bottleneck of attention, people aren't going to be paying attention to much of what you say, and they're not going to be able to think about much of what you say, right? So how do you get them to think about things, right? The idea is it has to be really relevant to them. If a train is coming towards you, you pay attention to it. If you see a train sort of in the distance going at the same speed, you might not pay attention to it so much, okay? I can go into details, but let me just give some advice. When we talk about climate science, the challenge we face is, if we're saying, let's reduce emission, someone says, why? Say, well, because there are polar ice caps and there are changes in the oceans. To someone, those things are very far away, they're very abstract. And then if you say, okay, well now drive a hybrid and use different light bulbs, you say, wait a minute, is that going to work? You're like, well, I'm not sure. I don't know. So the benefits are abstract, they're distant, and they're uncertain. And yet what you're asking people to do is give up something that is concrete, it's right in front of them, right? They can see it, and it's real. It doesn't matter what choice domain you're looking at. If you ask someone to give up something real for what to them seems like magic beans, they're typically not going to do it. So what do you do? What do you do? There is a strategy. You don't have to tell them about the abstract things necessarily. If what you want to do is get someone to change. Instead, you can make it close, or you can make it real, or you can make it personal. An example I like to use is global poverty is also a problem that is large, abstract, distant, right? Your ability to solve it uncertain. And yet every year, you can get small children, 5, 6, 7 years old, to raise tens of millions of dollars to combat global poverty. How do you do that? Well, you turn it into a UNICEF box. And on the box you print, if you raise 50 cents, a child will have a meal. And if you raise $4, they'll have a sweater. And if you raise another amount, they'll be able to go to school. That makes it real to them. They can relate to other children, right? There's big issues with global poverty. But what I'm saying is if you want that audience to contribute, as opposed to saying, the problem is too big, I can't do anything, right? That is true. They can't do anything. So make it a problem that they can do something about. Okay? So now, everything I've said to you so far, we could just say, well, maybe we just know that from education. We just know that from marketing. We don't really need science for this. And that might be. But when we're talking about climate change, we enter the political domain. We enter the domain of politics. And in politics, let me suggest to you that the conversational rules, the persuasive rules, change. And they change for an important reason that has to do with this figure. So my question to you is, what is that? What is that? Okay? What is it? What, anybody?
It's a rabbit.
It's a rabbit, right? It's a rabbit duck. It's a rabbit duck. Okay? So what you have, I'm going to walk away from the mic for a second. Is that going to, okay. It could be a duck, right? Here's the beak, here's the back of its head. Or it could be a rabbit. These are the ears, and there's the front of its head. Now, what's unusual about this figure is that it has multiple meanings. And we think that's weird, right? Because we say a picture's worth 1,000 words. We say that, we talk about the picture-word exchange rate in that way, because most pictures have a discrete meaning, where if you look at the meaning of any word in the English language, almost any word, you can go in the dictionary, it typically has multiple meanings. Words typically have multiple meanings, such as the word duck. It means what that thing might be, and it also means this. Okay? It's called language indeterminacy, the idea that words have multiple meanings. Now, why is this changing the rules of the game? Because if you take language indeterminacy and you mix it with politics, and what's politics? Well, it's the forum where we have value conflicts. It's the forum where we try and work out collective decisions in ways that in other areas of life we can't work them out. Issues aren't born political, they become political because we can't figure out how to deal with them another way. So we have underlying value conflicts, and now we have the indeterminacy with the language. What happens when you put them together? People try and use words strategically. People try and use words to get people to think in certain ways, right? You get language indeterminacy with a nasty edge. And it changes how people think about what they hear. It changes what they pay attention to. And if you walk into a situation thinking that this isn't relevant, if people think it's political, they're thinking about it differently. So instead of going through the technical aspects, I just want to give you an example of how different things could be, right? So credibility is going to be the key in these circumstances, but let me give you an example. Remember math class? 2nd grade, 3rd grade, 4th grade. What was that like? Well, for most of us, we were in a classroom. There were probably desks or tables, and they were pretty well organized. There was the front of the room where maybe there was a number line and some things about mathematics, and there was a teacher, maybe a podium and desk, and they were the center of attention. And they'd stand up there and they'd give lessons. You'd pay attention or not. You'd have tests. You'd take the test. Your teacher would see it. Your friends might see it. Your parents would see it, right? And that's a way of developing an environment for learning. And it was something we were kind of comfortable with. Now, my question to you is, how would we have to change that situation to make it like political communication? Okay? So let me suggest to you the changes we'd have to make. First, there are no exams. There are no exams. You know things, great. You don't know things, And if you had an exam, your parents aren't going to see it because you get to go in the voting booth by yourself. right? You get to do whatever you want, right? Cast whatever you want. That's not going to be there. There's information all over the place, not just in the front of the room. It's everywhere. You can pay attention to it if you want or not. But let me suggest that the most important difference is this. Suppose I'm your teacher and I walk up and I say, okay, class, 2 + 2 = 4. And then right after that, someone walks up after me and says, if you believe that, it will ruin your life. That's what political communication is. Someone makes a claim about how things work, and someone else says, look, not only is that wrong, but it's even wrong to think about it in that way. If you knew that that was coming, if you were a student, would you regard the claim by the teacher in the same way? If you knew that every claim was possibly contestable, you say, wait a minute, 2 + 2 = 4. What are you trying to do? What are you trying to convince me of? Right? It changes how people listen. It changes what you have to say. If you play by the conversational rules where you think that doesn't apply, and you're like, why aren't people listening to me? Why don't they believe me? That's why. Because your credibility is uncertain. Now, when it comes to politics, right, credibility is the big issue. And you might say, oh, but wait a minute. I know what I'm doing, right? I know my facts. I've organized them. I'm credible. And what I want to suggest to you is that is the wrong way to think about credibility. Because you do not get to convey, you don't get to give yourself credibility. Credibility is bestowed by an audience. It is domain specific. It's the reason why you can be in a room of your peers, you can make a particular speech, and they go, oh yes, that was very convincing. You can give exactly the same speech to a different audience, and they won't believe you at all, right? They'll think, they won't know what you're doing. Credibility is bestowed by an audience. We've been at seminars where we say, well, I'm a climate scientist, and I go talk to groups, and people don't listen. Or I'll walk into churches, and people question whether science is even relevant here, right? And one of the challenges is, how do you sort of convey your message in a way where people will find you credible, right? And the trick, again, we can get in mechanics, but the trick is, if you want to get them from where they are to some place where you want them to be, first what you have to know is where they are. In a sense, mentally, you have to become them for a second and think about, well, what are the things that are important to them, right? What are the things that they are capable of hearing? That's going to affect, if you can establish that, your credibility with an audience. But the fact that you have a title, the fact that you have previous accomplishments, that doesn't guarantee your credibility. Credibility must be bestowed by the audience, and it's based on things that they want. Now, it so happens that there is a huge scientific field that studies things like credibility. It spans economics and psychology. And there are 4 main areas of credibility. One has to do with source attributes, and what I mean by that is attributes of the speaker. Maybe that I have a PhD. Maybe that's helpful. Maybe I'm wearing a tie. Those are helpful things to some audiences. Audiences for whom it corresponds to one of 2 key factors: trust, the perception of trust, and the perception of knowledgeability. The idea is, if I'm presenting myself in a way such that you have a reason to trust what I'm saying, and I present myself in a way that you believe that I'm knowledgeable about this, then the attention is possible. Then you might start thinking about what I'm saying. But if I don't present myself in a way such that either of those things is going on, that is, I may seem knowledgeable, but for some reason I'm not trustworthy, you're going to lose the attention battle. People are not going to have an incentive to listen to you. Or if you seem trustworthy but ignorant, the same thing. Right? Necessary conditions for persuasion are having the kinds of attributes that give people an incentive to trust you and to see you as being informed. Now, the sad truth is that sometimes you can be in situations where you are knowledgeable and maybe you merit trust. But if you can't present yourself in ways that convey those to the audience, the reality doesn't matter. Right? So you might think, well, this is just terrible news. But I think it isn't. I think the news is there are really systematic features to how people choose whom to believe. There is a large scientific literature that establishes a bunch of bases of these. It is something you could know about. There are widely published and accessible books you could read about. But most people think, well, I don't need to know that because I'm great at persuasion. Right? But as I've indicated at the beginning, maybe you're just selecting cases where you were successful at persuasion and not thinking about the bigger picture, where all of us are probably not. Thinking about under what conditions will someone believe me is important, and you just can't take for granted that they will. So that's really the conclusion. many experts and advocates just overestimate their persuasive powers. It's not because they have bad intentions. They can have great intentions, right? But what that means is good intentions aren't enough, you have to have decent execution. You have to have a decent understanding of what people are doing. So that someone maybe would be better off believing what you say doesn't mean that they will. People often confound information transmission and competence transmission. I can provide information. I can send out 30,000 mailings. I can put up a website just as easily as anybody. But if what I care about is that a good investment of my time, right, I need to think a little bit about why would they tune into my website as opposed to the 4 billion other websites that are available to them. You know, if I have a target audience, why will they pay attention to me? Information transmission, trivial. Anybody can do that. Trying to get people to think, to give them new beliefs and skills, that's a different idea altogether, right? You can try and do it on your own. Some people are successful, or you can get some help. And there's a field of research that will tell you a lot about how to do it. It won't guarantee success, but it'll help you avoid a lot of mistakes that people just regularly make. And I think the last thing I'd like to leave you with is, again, coming to an audience. Sometimes, particularly in climate change, we think, all right, but still it's their fault, right? Even if I present it, they're not going to pay attention to it. Still, it's their fault, right? Because they're not, why aren't they paying more attention to me? The thing you have to remember about people's current beliefs, whatever they are, is it's not as if any new belief can come in and replace their existing belief. The belief that they have when you encounter them is like the heavyweight champ. It has defeated, throughout their lifetimes, or at least in the immediate past, other beliefs that they could have had. Given their world experience, given what they can see, it's beaten off all the other defenders. So that means, for them, it kind of works, whatever their belief is. To get their attention, somehow you have to demonstrate to them that their current belief doesn't work in a way that affects them, right? It doesn't work in a way that affects them. How do you do that? I think you take down the level of abstraction. You make things real, you make them close, you make them personal, right? That's kind of simple advice in a way, but you're always in a constant battle of attention. The bottleneck doesn't change just because you have good ideas. The bottleneck is always a small number of chunks, and the competition for attention is ongoing. In the internet change, it's just apparent. But in fact, even when people aren't surfing the web, there are all different kinds of things they can think about, right? For you to win that battle, right, for you to win the battle of attention, it's important to think about how they're viewing things and what their capabilities are. You can succeed, but it takes a little bit of thought.
Thanks, Sir.
My name is Molly Bentley, and I'm a regular contributor to BBC Science Radio and Science Nature online, and I am an American, and I'm based here, so if you're wondering why there's no accent, that's the reason. Now, the first International Polar Year was from 1882 to 1883, and it was a collaborative effort to understand fundamental questions of meteorology and geophysics. Well, we're now in the fourth International Polar Year, which is organized by the International Council for Science and the World Meteorological Organization. And during this time, many scientists will be asked to explain their IPY research to a reporter or to the general public. And I'll suggest ways in which you can do that for the scientists in the room during IPY in particular, but the suggestions apply to how you convey scientific research in general. For scientists who work in the polar regions, Antarctica and the Arctic are a second home. The icy landscapes, the chilly temperatures, and the scientific questions that compel them to travel to the ends of the earth are all familiar. Even those in the public whom have never visited these icy places can still appreciate their beauty and their role in the planet's climate system. But for the rest of the public, the Antarctic and the Arctic are faraway places, beautiful and exotic in photographs, but otherwise unreal. They're a block of ice somewhere on the end of the earth. The challenge during IPY is to get the public to care about that block of ice. But to reach the public also often means talking to a journalist, and this isn't always easy. As a scientist, maybe you've had a bad experience with the press, your work was misrepresented, or perhaps you're just uncertain how to interact with what seems like an alien species. But journalists and scientists can work this out because ultimately we're on the same side. We're both trying to communicate to the public. And while there may be a communication gap between reporters and scientists, the communication gulf is much wider between scientists and journalists, us, and the public. And it's the public that you're trying to reach. This is your audience. So I'd like to give you some things to keep in mind while discussing IPY with a journalist, and particular tips for talking to a radio reporter. But much of this applies to talking to reporters in general. But with the growing popularity of podcasting, chances are that even the print reporters that you talk to will want to make an audio recording. And I interviewed a neuroscientist recently for the BBC World Service. Now, this audience is 30 million English speakers and 163 million total. And he said excitedly, "But will it be podcast?" With the limited science coverage these days, the reporter covering your story may not have a science background, and most reporters are willing to do their homework. But we may be entering the subject as a beginner. And this was the case for me. I was working on a story of the sea urchin genome, and I had to learn about regulatory genes. These are those that turn other genes on and off. And the scientist I interviewed, he gave me a book that he wrote on regulatory genes in an effort to be helpful, which he assured me would be accessible to the general reader. Here's a typical page from that book. Here's another one. You really need a degree in molecular biology to understand this, and so after a while I just gave up. Although I have to say, I do feel I had seen the images somewhere else before. So the point is that even though you think, well, yes, but that's genomics, and that your description of the mechanisms controlling the sensitivity of the Atlantic thermohaline circulation to the parameterization of eddy transports in an ocean GMC is self-explanatory, others may not see it that way. The polar regions can feel as remote as the moon of Jupiter. And I say of Jupiter because anyone can step outside and see our own moon and connect with it, if only in a romantic way. But for much of the public, the Arctic and Antarctica in particular are distant places that they'll never visit. Their relevance to daily life is just not obvious. And the IPY committee has identified a number of themes for framing its research program, which can help you here, from the present environmental status of the polar regions to how they're changing, how polar weather and climate, the air and sea interaction contribute to a global system. And these are the broad themes that can help you frame your research when the public asks, why go to the poles? It's important to explain to the public why these remote places matter to you, but also why they matter to them. For example, researchers use the poles as a vantage point for investigating phenomena such as the sun. But for your audience, it's not obvious why on earth you'd go to the ends of the earth to study a G-type star that's visible from your own backyard. Also, you want to be able to answer the question of why your research matters. What is it about? This is going to be obvious to you, but it can be lost on the public. What is your central question? The question of how biogeochemical cycles are affected by circumpolar climate interactions in the Southern Ocean may be one that burns for you, but it won't for others unless you explain it in accessible terms. Breaking the science down is necessary for the public to understand what are even basic concepts. After a public IPY talk in Oakland, California, for example, a scientist showed a graph of global temperatures, and he showed how these global temperatures were going up. And when the auditorium was opened up for questions from the audience, a man raised his hand and said earnestly, "Do you think that this global warming could be contributing to this climate change?" And the scientist, who was unflappable, explained the connection. And obviously, such a question at this point in the climate debate is distressing. However, it demonstrates how clear and persistent scientific explanation can help the public make crucial connections. Now, you may not be able to communicate all aspects of your research. In radio, at least, even in a half-hour show, the rule of thumb is your audience may remember only 2 points. So what should they be? For example, with regard to the drilling into the rock core beneath the Antarctic ice sheet, this is a project known as ANDRIL. 1, the ANDRIL sediment cores will take us back further in time than any cores have so far to tell us about the past Antarctic ice sheet. And 2, understanding the past Antarctic ice sheet tells us about past sea levels, and the past is a prediction for the future. These are the facts about the Andril project. And you may feel that the facts speak for themselves. But research into the communication of science, as you're learning this morning, to the public, communicating science to the public has shown otherwise. People pay attention to science and can absorb the facts when they can make a personal connection to it all, when it represents something that they value. So you may consider framing your research so that it is relevant and meaningful to your audience. One technique is to provide a local angle. How will your research into the Arctic affect people in Quincy, Illinois? It's not obvious. Geologist Kathy Licht explains the consequences of a changing Arctic climate this way. The Earth's climate system is connected from top to bottom, from end to end. We change the poles, we change the weather on the planet. Let people know that the poles are the anti-Vegas. What happens at the poles doesn't stay at the poles. Provide a local angle to a reporter. The connection between melting ice and sea level rise is a compelling example, nowhere more so than here in New Orleans, where large portions of the city are below sea level. The flooding robs people more of their land and of their homes. What happens when the salt water contaminates the city's drinking supply? Well, it's a question for New Orleans as well as it is for other coastal cities around the world. But not all IPY work is focused on climate change, and so there may not be an immediate local connection. How do you engage someone in Kentucky about the microbiological communities that thrive in the slush of a winter Arctic lake? Well, the Earth's climate system is dependent on what microbes eat. These invisible bugs make up the bulk of the world's biomass. And 1 teaspoon of dirt from your garden in Louisville may contain up to 1 billion microbes. And that's enough to keep you up at night. The Arctic, the top of the world, the polar cap, the North Pole, these all conjure a distant land, cold and barren. But the Arctic is a living place. For animals, birds, and humans, the Arctic is home, as the Antarctic is for the elephant seals that you hear. Creating an image of the Arctic and the Antarctic as a living place helps the public connect with it. And as compelling as photographs are, you can do without them. Share stories about the creatures that many of us will never see in their natural habitat. Biologist Michael Castellini describes rare footage of a mother polar bear repeatedly rearing up on her hind legs and smashing down on the ice beneath.
You got to realize this is a 1,200-pound animal. And she was, in this particular footage, is standing up on her haunches and then smashing herself down onto the ice. And what she's trying to get to are seals that hide themselves. The seals come to a hole in the ice and then dig basically a cave between the ice and the snow layer above it. So you can actually be out on the Arctic ice and think there's nothing there. And actually there are seals all over the place. They've just hidden themselves underneath the snow and the ice there. And she's trying to smash her way down into a seal hole in order to grab a seal. And the reason she's doing that is she has to feed her cubs. And seals are their preferred food. And so she was trying to catch a seal to feed her cubs. These are the largest predators on the planet. And it's an incredible thing to see. And they're all perfectly white, obviously, except for their nose. And they are such good hunters that when they are sort of skulking their way along the ice looking for seals, and they are watching a seal and seal's watching them, they'll cover their nose with their paw so that their black nose disappears, and so the seals can't see the little black dot moving. It's a great trick.
Appeal also to our collective history. The polar regions are an archive of the planet's climate history. The core is extracted from the ocean floor next to the Antarctic ice sheet by the Andril team, for example, may tell us whether or not the continent was lush and green 20 million years ago. The purpose of the first IPY was to understand the basic processes that drive global meteorological and geophysical phenomena. The quest to understand those dynamics continues today. But the polar regions are also sites of some of humankind's most dramatic endeavors. There's a human history here, from the feats of endurance performed by Scott, Amundsen, and Shackleton, to the pioneering exploration of the IGY scientists in 1957 and 1958, to today's researchers who are forging a new scientific frontier. The poles hold with them the story of the golden age of exploration and an increasing sure-footedness in a forbidding landscape, along with the growth, step by sometimes leap, in the scientific understanding of our planet. You and your work are part of that scientific legacy. Well, now that I've talked about clarifying the message, here are a few tips on style. Radio is different from print because radio goes by fast, and you have one shot to get the listener's attention while that attention is divided. People eat, they read, and they drive all while listening to the radio, although some of them do that while reading a newspaper too, at least in California. Drawing their attention to science while they're doing that is especially tricky. It's important to avoid technical language and jargon. Use language that everybody can understand. Don't assume that people know what albedo is, but they do understand how much it reflects. You can substitute temperature control for thermal regulation and not lose 1 joule in translation. Remember your audience, and this doesn't mean that you have to avoid complex ideas. If you study energy transfer between the trophic species in the Arctic, then you study who eats whom in the food web and how much of whom do they eat. Well-produced radio creates vivid images in the mind's eye. Your work takes you to exciting and exotic places, so describe them to us. Give me an image that I can see while I'm listening to the radio. So let's say I'm in the kitchen and I'm baking a pie, and the radio's on, and I hear you say that you've been coring in the Greenland ice sheet. Okay, I've got the image, but maybe you should say a little bit more. What does an ice core look like? These are kilometers-long popsicles. How do you pull them out without breaking them? And what can they tell us? Geoscientist Richard Alley describes how the layers in ice cores can take us back years in time.
And so we can count years. The thickness of a year tells you how much it snowed. The concentration of dust or pollen or what have you in the ice tells you what was blowing through the air. And as the snow turned to ice, it trapped little bubbles, and those are bottles of old air that are just sitting there. So if you actually want to know what was the composition of the atmosphere, it's there too.
Also, don't leave out the day-to-day stories of survival. What's it like to work on a block of ice? Share your feeling that you had when you first went to the pole. What do you see when you step onto the deck of an icebreaker? What does it feel like to breathe air that's 70 degrees below zero? People also love stories of hardship, so describe how you once almost fell into a crevasse. Although you probably wouldn't be here then talk about it, because those are actually quite deep. But even the ordinary is extraordinary for those who have not been where you have, and the poles are among the few remaining frontiers. And I asked my father, Charles Bentley, who went to the Antarctic during IGY 50 years ago, where did you sleep?
During the summertime, the team was about 6 people, and we lived in 3 snowcats, which are over snow vehicles.
You lived in the vehicles?
Yeah, we had some benches built inside that we used both for our instruments and to spread out our sleeping bags during the nighttime.
So is it like living in a tank, something like that?
Well, yeah, I guess I've never lived in a tank, so I can't make that analogy. But they were big enough so that you could stretch out full length. It wasn't like living curled up in a ball.
Do you lose your sense of direction when you're in Antarctica and you just see a white plane in every direction? Do you ever sometimes wonder which way is up?
Well, when the sun isn't out, or whether there's some mist or fog, one can lose all sense of which way is up and which way is down, except what gravity tells you. It's just like being in a bottle of milk. Everything is white in all directions. And I remember one time seeing what I thought was a 55-gallon drum off a ways, and I walked over to it. And when I got a little closer, I saw it wasn't a 55-gallon drum at all. It was a small tin can. And I hadn't been able to tell the difference because I didn't have any sense of where the horizon was.
What sort of person does go to Antarctica? Because I would assume that it takes a certain amount of stamina to deal with the conditions there, the isolation, the cold temperature.
Well, I suppose being somewhat of a stoic helps.
Are you a stoic?
I think so. Liking cold weather certainly helps. But I think what was most sustaining for me was my interest in the science that I was doing, because there were some very remarkable findings that we had, in particular that the ice was so thick. We were actually on what would have been an ocean before the ice sheet formed.
You're a witness to an extraordinary environment, so take your audience there. With ice sheets the size of the United States and ice cores millions of years old, scientists working at the polar regions are dealing with scales in time and space that the public can't relate to. Analogies to something they're familiar with help convey difficult concepts by creating a picture in the mind's eye. So here are some you can choose from. As we walk across the ice sheet that drapes Greenland like a cloak and pull out ice cores, our time machines to the past, we find that the Earth's atmosphere is heating up like a hen in a wool blanket, and that the salt water, which sinks to the bottom like sugar in your coffee cup and drives its currents, is being diluted faster than good whiskey in a cheap bar, a process that may halt the thermohaline circulation as sure as jamming a fork into the conveyor belt at a grocery store. The idea is to create a vivid image that stays with people, and that leads me to radio captures the great oral tradition of storytelling, and every scientific discovery has a story behind it. Share the narrative story of your research as well as your set of data. Describe how one question led to another, led to an experiment, led to results and discovery, and include the human elements, the inspiration, the curiosity, the tedium, the frustration, and the delight that you felt at unraveling a scientific mystery. And finally, be yourself and enjoy yourself. Don't give a lecture and let your personality come through. On radio, your enthusiasm and your energy not only capture a listener's attention, but they're infectious. They allow the audience to feel some of the passion that you have for your work. And don't worry about stumbling because we edit. So to summarize, convey to the public the big picture. Why do the poles matter and what can be learned by going there? Certainly say why your research matters. Explain what this means to people personally. Describe the poles as a place where animals and where humans live. And put your work in the context of history, either of climate history or of the human endeavor. And how you say it is as important as what you say. Don't polylogise with abstruse rhetoric. Provide an image that I can hold in my mind. Think like a poet. Share the human story, and be yourself. But if I had to give you two things to take away from this, one, tell a human story about your research during IPY, and two, give us a reason to care about it. And don't wait to talk to a reporter to put all of this in practice. As scientists, you should spend more time talking to non-scientists. Practice describing your work without all the technical terms. So my advice is to go to a cocktail party, but in this case, I'd look for an icebreaker. And practice talking with ordinary people about your work. Gauge by their reaction and their puzzled looks as to how well you're doing, and figure out how to put succinctly why your research during IPY matters. Remember why you got into this field of science, draw on your enthusiasm for it, and convey that to your listeners. Thank you.